morning.
Morning.
Happy to see all this morning. A little cooler. At least it's not 96 degrees yet. How many have enjoyed dining out? Especially at buffets. I like to go to a buffet. But to hear about the guy who went to a Chinese buffet, and as he going along the buffet line, choosing his dishes, the lid pops up on one, and two eyeballs look out, and the lid goes back down. He thought he was just imagining things. He's walking along, all of a sudden the lid pops up again, two eyes look out, lid goes back down. He steps back and he scratches his head and he calls the waiter over, and the waiter says, what's the problem? He goes, where's this dish over here? Look, he's popping up, two eyes come out, it pops back down. The waiter says, oh, no problem, sir. That's just Peking duck. Tough crowd, tough.
Lucky we don't have tomatoes.
Pardon?
You're lucky we don't have tomatoes.
Yeah. I'd have salad to go by Peking duck.
I have to shoot the duck cake.
You know, there's times as soon as I go out to eat, I really can't decide what I want. In fact, she said, well, what do you want? And I said, I don't know. Well, there's no restaurant named I don't know, so how do you get that? So we usually go to Golden Corral till I can get what I want, as much as I want, my $9 or $10, and I don't have to worry about making specific choices. So you wander up down the buffet line, get a little of this, a little of that, a little of this. Oh yeah, I gotta have some of this. And next thing you know, why, you got 2 platefuls. Go back, sit down. There's such a variety of things, from the main entree, the salad selections, the bread, and yes, the best part, the desserts. You find you're doing the old gazing and grazing routine. What's even better is that there's some restaurants you can go to that you can go back more than once. You can go back twice, back 3 times, go back more than that if you can still get out of your chair. You can even get a container now at Golden Corral to buy and load it to capacity, take home, warm up, eat later on if you feel hungry yet. There's also buffets in which you can tell the servers from the grazers, because the servers wear aprons and the grazers wear bibs. In this week's First Testament text, it reads the final words of Moses' third and final discourse in Deuteronomy, when the law and the covenant God has put before his people. As has been the focus throughout Deuteronomy, Moses' final emphasis is on a divine demand for loyalty, obedience, and love. Loyalty to the one and only God, and rejection of all the other enticing and powerful other gods of the cultures that surround and threaten to overwhelm Israel. Obedience. Obedience to God's law, to reach and to teach each and every part of the Torah. And love. Love for the God who had chosen to establish an eternal, loving relationship with the people, and who continues to offer them life in the presence of the divine. Loyalty, obedience, love. These are the watchwords of the call to faithfulness in Deuteronomy. God's commandment is not too difficult, nor is it beyond your reach. The law is not among those things that humble persons don't bother with, or that even the wise find beyond their understanding. It is not, therefore, impossibly idealistic, impractical, unachievable. We've noticed earlier the balance achieved between ideal standards and earthly realities. The other that God deliberately made the law so exacting that nobody would ever be able to live by it belongs to a distorted theology that tries unnecessarily to gild the gospel by belittling the law. And the frequent claims by various psalmists to have lived according to God's law are neither exaggerated nor exceptional. They arise from the natural assumption that ordinary people can indeed live in a way that is broadly pleasing to God and delightful. This is neither self-righteousness nor a claim to sinless perfection. The same psalmists are equally quick to confess their sin and failings, fully realizing that the only grace that could forgive and cleanse them would likewise enable them to live again in covenant obedience. Obedience to the law of the Old Testament, as has been stressed repeatedly, was not the means of achieving salvation, but the response to a salvation that was already experienced. The book of Deuteronomy is the last book of the Torah. And such Deuteronomy offered the Torah's last words on what was expected of God's people, and what they could expect in return as they stood in their new, unique relationship with God. In the wilderness inspiration scenes, Satan quotes the Psalms, while Jesus quoted back Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy was also the biblical book most quoted by Americans during the founding era. Today's Old Testament lesson addresses the issues of choice in the religious life of God's people. Here, Moses' task has been completed. He has led God's people out of the Egyptian bondage through the wilderness. The promised land was now in sight. Their instruction in faith was complete. God's buffet table was visible just across the Jordan River. The people were ready to don their bibs. They were eager to stop gazing and begin grazing. They were ready to change their identity from losers to choosers. However, their choice was not as simple as deciding whether to select meatloaf or fried chicken. Their choice was truly a matter of life and death. I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live. In verse 19. That's a powerful choice, an even more powerful promise. It should also be a pretty easy no-brainer. Who among us would choose curses over blessings, not just for ourselves, but for our entire families for generations to come? Who among us, in their right minds, would choose death over life? Naturally, we choose life and blessings every time. After all, we shape our future by the choices we make in the present. So let's look back at God's people in our text. Their history up to this point certainly was not filled with good life choices. They often turned away from the Lord and worshiped other gods. They were often unjust and unfair in their treatment of the poor and vulnerable. They often ignored and even openly opposed the leadership of Moses. And they often experienced bitter quarreling and dissension in their midst, just like roots sprouting poisonous and bitter growth. Choosing life and blessings was not as easy as it looked for God's people then. It is at least as difficult for us today, especially during the troubled and frightening times we live in. When the storms and challenges of life are crashing upon us from every direction, it's almost impossible to make any decision at all, except to stop the immediate pain and eliminate the overwhelming fear. We will choose any part to ride out the storm in safety. But Moses' third and final discourse, Deuteronomy, runs from actually chapter 29, verse 1 through chapter 30, verse 20. Much of what is said here has been said before in Deuteronomy, but in this condensed version, the treaty or covenant format is clearly obvious. Part of that structure involves offering a series of dire circumstances and ominous warnings, pointing toward what would result if Israel were to turn their back on this covenant. But Moses does hold out hope, not despair, in his final passage. For by the time we reach this point in our story, he affirms that the people will return to the Lord their God, and they will obey him. And this return is not merely a return to the covenant obedience. It's a return to nothing less than life itself. It's Moses' final, powerful admonition. to his people. That they are facing a clear-cut choice between life and prosperity or death and adversity. The Hebrew word tov in English means prosperity. It means more than simple economic success. It refers to every type of well-being to be honored, respected, loved, blessed with family, friends, wealth, and health. When given a choice between that life and the opposite, death and adversity, who would choose the latter? When Moses proclaimed, "See, I set before you," the clear assumption is that the choice has already been made. After all, the covenant was already cut at Horeb. But that choosing must continue every day, as demonstrated by the people's ongoing obedience to the terms of God's covenant. Requirements for obedience is presented in verses 16 and 18 and recalls earlier passages of Deuteronomy, as does a list of promises. The obedience being called for here and throughout Deuteronomy is not simply willed action or performing required activities. This obedience is a spiritual and emotional commitment to Deuteronomy declares to be love. Loving the Lord your God is the essence of obedience. Disobedience is defined as when you turn your hearts away from loving God. It is God's intense love for the people that has brought them into this covenant relationship. Even as God was drawn in this love for Israel's ancestors, this new generation is called to respond by holding fast to their God who loves them. This covenant of loyalty, obedience, and love is formulated by Moses' invocation of heaven and earth to witness. While other ancient Near Eastern cultures invoked the presence of other deities and powers, Deuteronomy continued confirmation of the existence of but one God means that only the heavens and the earth, that which God himself has created, can be offered as standing witnesses to the covenantal relationship. And Moses' final assertion that you shall have life and shall long endure upon the land, translated literally as, for that is your life and the length of your days. And this phrase has been adapted into the evening recitation of the Jewish liturgy. God's commandments and the words of his Torah are your life and length of your days. Choosing life, choosing loyalty, obedience, and love is what brings life to the living. Even with these specific directions, God's people often miss the mark completely. Left to their own efforts, they would deserve not life and blessings, but death and curses. In the very next chapter of Deuteronomy, the Lord tells Moses that after Moses dies, the people will begin to worship pagan gods in their midst and will forsake God by breaking the covenant that they made. They have eaten their fill and grown fat. They will turn to other gods, despising me and breaking my covenant. Left on our own, we cannot follow clear directions of God's teachings or decrees. Left on our own, life can be just one curse after another. Then we die. Left on our own in the middle of life's curse troubles, we gaze at folks who seem to have it all together. We long to graze at their buffet table of happiness and security. If only we could just understand the step-by-step directions to success and joy. You know, I suppose it would have been far easier and more convenient for God to have created robots instead of offspring capable of making choices. If Adam and Eve had not been cognizant, thinking individuals with the ability of choosing, the Garden of Eden would probably still be in full flower. Think about it. If Absalom had been a puppet, history would surely remember him as something other than a long-haired renegade son? If Jonah had not had a choice, there'd be no story of Jonah and the great fish. If Christ had not had a choice, the cross would be reduced to a foreordained act of brutal cosmic drama. If we had no choice, there would be no such thing as sin. For we could not possibly or responsibly do either good or bad. However, God loved humanity enough, trusted enough, to bless it with choices. The blessing appears at times to be a curse. Even the Apostle Paul lamented, for the good that I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. None of us need to be reminded that our choices are accompanied by consequences. Sometimes the passage of time is required, but inevitably we get the message. Our greed for quick crops several decades ago resulted in overplanting. The consequence we know was the Dust Bowl. Many manufacturers have chosen to have a greater regard for profits than for properly caring for the waste and pollution created by their factories and plants. The consequences have been that our lungs and atmosphere, our streams and wildlife are paying the price for that choice. Even our military chooses to broadcast Agent Orange, a toxic herbicide, over millions of acres in Vietnam as a defoliant during the war. The consequences were not that the vegetation was defoliated, it's now believed to be responsible for lots of deaths. Genetic mutations, cancer and other diseases, of course, Vietnam vets. Americans continue to choose a lifestyle which requires far more than our share of world resources. The consequences is poor stewardship on the one hand and resentment from other countries on the other. God could have made it much easier on himself had he created robots. But he trusted us enough to give us a choice. Consequence is we have made some bad choices over our lives. In verse 15 of our text, the alternatives are set before Israel. I have set before you this day life and good, death and evil. The consequence is told in verse 16. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his way, and by keeping his commandments, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in this land. Moses challenged Israel to choose life, to obey God, and therefore continue to experience his blessings. God doesn't force his will upon anyone, whether it's back then or today. He lets us decide whether to follow him or reject him. The decision, however, is a life or death matter. God wants us to realize this, for he will and he would like us to choose life. Daily, in each new situation, we must affirm and reinforce this commitment. The choices sound familiar, as does the consequence. Choosing life, choosing loyalty, and love is what brings life to the living.